The weight of silence. The courtroom was still, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch time. Every shuffle of paper and muffled cough echoed through the room like thunder. The young man standing at the defendant's table looked no older than 20. His name was Daniel Carter. He wore an ill-fitted suit, borrowed from his older brother, which only emphasized how out of place he looked in this sterile, unforgiving environment. His brown hair was messy, as though he'd run his hands through it 100 times in frustration, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. Daniel's mother sat behind him, clutching her rosary tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. She had begged him to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down. Daniel hadn't even realized he'd been in trouble until the night he'd been arrested. It had started with a misunderstanding, or at least that's what Daniel kept telling himself. He had been on the wrong side of town, waiting for a friend who never showed. When the police arrived, they found him leaning against the back wall of a closed hardware store. To them, he looked like a kid up to no good, maybe a thief scoping out his next target. They arrested him on the spot, ignoring his protests. Now, he stood in front of Judge Gerald Hawkins, a man notorious for his strict rulings and disdain for leniency. Hawkins was a man of law, not mercy, and Daniel knew from the moment he walked into the courtroom that he was already guilty in the judge's eyes. "State your case," Judge Hawkins barked at Daniel's lawyer, a wiry man named Evan Marks, who looked as exhausted as Daniel felt. Evan had taken the case pro bono, but his confidence had been steadily waning under the judge's icy glare. "Your Honor," Evan began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room, "my client has no criminal record. He was merely waiting for a friend, not attempting to trespass or commit any crime." The judge raised a skeptical eyebrow, leaning back in his chair, and yet he was found loitering behind a business after hours. "That doesn't sound like an innocent teenager to me, Mr. Marks." Evan hesitated, sensing the futility of his argument. "With respect, Your Honor, there is no evidence of any wrongdoing. There are no witnesses claiming he attempted to break in, no tools or items that suggest malicious intent." "Enough," Judge Hawkins interrupted, his voice sharp and dismissive. "This court doesn't have time for excuses." Daniel felt his heart sink. He glanced over at his mother, whose tearful gaze only deepened his guilt. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Why couldn't they see that? The prosecutor, a young woman named Kelly Morris, stood up next. Unlike Evan, she seemed to have the judge's full attention. Kelly wasn't particularly harsh, but her arguments were concise and painted Daniel in a less than favorable light. "The defendant was in a restricted area," she stated firmly. "Regardless of his intentions, he had no business being there. This is a straightforward case, Your Honor." Judge Hawkins nodded, clearly in agreement. "Indeed, it seems open and shut to me." Evan stood again, his tone more urgent now. "Your Honor, I would like to call attention to the character witnesses we have provided." Judge Hawkins slammed his gavel, cutting him off. "This isn't a debate, Mr. Marks. The facts are what they are. If your client wanted to avoid trouble, he shouldn't have put himself in this position." Daniel's legs felt weak. He could barely keep himself standing. Was this it? Was this how his life was going to change forever, over something he didn't even do? The judge picked up his gavel again, signaling the end of the discussion. "If there are no further arguments, I'm ready to make my ruling." Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had run out of arguments. Daniel's fate was sealed. But just as the gavel was about to strike, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound was jarring in the otherwise silent room, and every head turned to see who had entered. A man stepped in, his tall frame silhouetted against the sunlight streaming through the open doors. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor as he strode purposefully toward the front of the room. His presence was commanding, and the murmurs in the gallery quickly subsided. The judge narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Who are you, and why are you disrupting my courtroom?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a badge. "My name is Andrew Sinclair, Special Investigator for the Office of Judicial Oversight. I'm here on official business." The room fell into stunned silence. Judge Hawkins' expression shifted from annoyance to something more cautious. "Official business," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "This is highly irregular." Andrew Sinclair didn't flinch. So was dismissing the case without properly reviewing the evidence. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Daniel's eyes widened. Who was this man, and why was he here? The judge scowled, gripping the arms of his chair tightly. "You'd better have a good reason for this interruption." "I do," Sinclair said calmly. He gestured to a clerk, who quickly brought him a thick folder. "I've been reviewing your rulings, Judge Hawkins, and I've noticed a troubling pattern." A murmur spread through the room. The judge's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "I won't tolerate these baseless accusations in my courtroom." Sinclair remained unfazed. "Then you won't mind if I present this evidence to the court," he said, holding up the folder. "It not only clears the defendant of any wrongdoing, but also highlights a history of biased rulings against young defendants from disadvantaged backgrounds." The room erupted in whispers, and the judge's composure faltered for the first time. Daniel's heart raced. Could this really be happening? Judge Hawkins' voice trembled as he attempted to regain control. "Order. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." But it was too late. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Andrew Sinclair had come prepared, and it was clear he wasn't going to back down. Daniel didn't know who this man was or why he had chosen to intervene, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come to light. The stranger's gambit. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, a taut string ready to snap at any moment. Andrew Sinclair's calm yet unyielding demeanor had shifted the dynamic entirely. He stood at the center of the room, his presence drawing all attention. Judge Hawkins, visibly flustered, attempted to maintain his usual commanding authority, but cracks were already forming in his facade. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge said, his voice clipped, "this is highly unorthodox. You are not the defense counsel. You have no standing in this case." Sinclair raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Your Honor, I am here not as defense counsel, but as an officer of oversight, tasked with ensuring that justice is upheld fairly and without bias. That mandate gives me every right to be here." The murmurs among the gallery grew louder, and Judge Hawkins slammed his gavel to quiet them. But the usual commanding force behind the strike seemed to falter. "This is a court of law, Mr. Sinclair, not a platform for accusations. If you have evidence, present it through proper channels." "I fully intend to, Your Honor," Sinclair replied, his tone measured but firm. "But before you rule on this case, I request that you review this file in its entirety." He placed the thick folder on the judge's bench. The leather-bound cover gave it an air of gravity that matched Sinclair's presence. Judge Hawkins hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the folder, then back to Sinclair. For a moment, it seemed as if the judge might refuse outright. But the weight of the room, the watchful eyes of the gallery, the curious prosecutor, the trembling defendant, pressed down on him. With a reluctant sigh, Hawkins reached for the folder. He opened it with the precision of a man trying to maintain his composure, but the further he read, the more his expression changed. His usual scowl gave way to a furrowed brow, his lips pressing into a tight line. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone waited. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. He exchanged a glance with his lawyer, who looked just as bewildered by the sudden turn of events. Sinclair broke the silence. "What you're holding, Your Honor, is a comprehensive analysis of your rulings over the past 10 years, with particular attention to cases involving young defendants from low-income backgrounds." The judge's head shot up, his face pale. "I don't see how my record is relevant to this case." "It's relevant," Sinclair said coolly. Because your history reveals a pattern of disproportionately harsh sentences for defendants who share similar socioeconomic profiles to Mr. Carter. This pattern raises serious questions about your impartiality. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Judge Hawkins' grip on the folder tightened. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice rising. "You dare question my integrity?" Sinclair stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the judge's. "I'm not questioning it, Your Honor. The evidence is." The prosecutor, Kelly Morris, stood hesitantly, looking between Sinclair and the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cautious, "if there's validity to these claims, it could impact not just this case but others. I believe we should recess to review the materials thoroughly." Judge Hawkins glared at her, clearly perceiving her suggestion as a betrayal. "There is no need for a recess," he barked. "This is a smear campaign, orchestrated to undermine my authority." But Sinclair was relentless. "Then refute the evidence, Your Honor," he challenged. "Explain why your sentencing record deviates so drastically from the average for similar cases." The judge opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The gallery sat in stunned silence, the once ironclad authority of Judge Hawkins visibly crumbling. Sinclair turned to address the room, his voice steady and clear. "This case is about more than Daniel Carter," he said. "It's about whether our justice system serves everyone equally, regardless of their background. When those in power allow personal biases to influence their decisions, they undermine the very foundation of justice." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. For weeks, he had felt powerless, trapped in a system that seemed determined to crush him. Now, for the first time, he felt seen, not as a troublemaker, but as a young man whose life mattered. Sinclair gestured toward the gallery. "Many of you have likely seen or experienced similar injustices. How many lives have been derailed by snap judgments, by a system that sees people like Daniel as statistics rather than individuals?" The murmurs began again, this time filled with agreement. A few people nodded, others whispered to those beside them. Judge Hawkins' face was beet red, his composure unraveling under the weight of Sinclair's words. "I move to dismiss this case," Even Mark said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "The evidence clearly supports my client's innocence, and this court's ability to rule impartially is in serious question." "Out of order," Hawkins barked, slamming his gavel so hard it echoed through the room. "I will not tolerate this circus in my courtroom." Sinclair stepped closer to the bench, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Your Honor, refusing to address this evidence won't make it disappear. It will only deepen the scrutiny you're already under. The Department of Judicial Oversight has authorized a full investigation into your conduct. Do you really want to make this harder on yourself?" The judge froze, the gavel still in his hand. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. The gallery, the prosecutor, the defendant, all were watching, waiting to see what he would do. After what felt like an eternity, Hawkins set the gavel down. His hand trembled as he reached for the folder again. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. Finally, he sighed heavily, the fight draining from his posture. "I need time to review this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sinclair nodded. "Take all the time you need, Your Honor. But in the meantime, I urge you to reconsider the charges against Mr. Carter. The evidence against him is non-existent, and any ruling today would be tainted by the questions surrounding this court's impartiality." Hawkins didn't respond. He simply slumped back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the folder as if it were a weight he couldn't lift. The room sat in stunned silence, the once immovable force of Judge Hawkins brought to a standstill by the relentless determination of one man. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. He turned to Even, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. For the first time since his arrest, the faintest glimmer of hope began to take root in Daniel's chest. As the judge finally adjourned the court for a recess, Sinclair turned and caught Daniel's gaze. There was something in his eyes, something steady, unyielding, and deeply reassuring. Daniel didn't know why this man had chosen to fight for him, but he was grateful beyond words. As Sinclair walked out of the courtroom, the whispers of the gallery followed him. He had shifted the course of the day, perhaps even the course of many lives, and everyone in the room knew it. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his mother rushing to his side to wrap him in a tight embrace. "It's not over yet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But maybe it'll be okay now." He nodded, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on the doors where Sinclair had exited. Whoever he was, whatever had brought him here, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Andrew Sinclair was not just a man. He was a force for justice, a beacon of hope in a system that so often felt hopeless. The storm within. The courtroom adjourned for the recess, but the tension in the air lingered like an approaching storm. Daniel sat beside his lawyer, even Marks, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. His mother leaned in, her voice soft but urgent. "Who is that man, Daniel? The one who spoke up for you?" she asked, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, Mom. I've never seen him before." Even chimed in, his tone tinged with admiration. "Andrew Sinclair. I've heard the name. He's a special investigator with the Department of Judicial Oversight, a big deal in legal circles. If he's here, it's because he's been tracking something serious." Daniel looked toward the doors where Sinclair had exited, his thoughts racing. Why would someone like that care about his case? What had drawn him here at the 11th hour? The gallery buzzed with murmurs as people speculated about what would happen next. Judge Hawkins had retreated to his chambers, likely poring over the damning evidence Sinclair had presented. The prosecution team whispered among themselves, their earlier confidence replaced by unease. Even Kelly Morris, the lead prosecutor, looked shaken. Daniel's mother reached for his hand, her grip firm. "This could be your chance, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "This could be the moment everything changes." But Daniel wasn't so sure. Years of struggle, of watching doors close in his face, had taught him not to trust in miracles. And yet here was a man, a stranger, who had walked into his life and tipped the scales. For the first time, Daniel felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. In the judge's chambers, Gerald Hawkins paced back and forth, the folder Sinclair had presented clutched tightly in his hands. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he read through page after page of evidence. Each document was a damning indictment of his conduct. Disparities in sentencing, disproportionate rulings against young defendants from disadvantaged backgrounds, and even instances where his decisions had been overturned on appeal due to clear bias. Hawkins slammed the folder onto his desk, his chest heaving. "Who does he think he is, walking into my courtroom like that?" he muttered to himself, but the anger in his voice couldn't hide the fear. He had spent decades cultivating his reputation as a no-nonsense judge, a man who upheld the law without compromise. But now, that very reputation was unraveling before his eyes. Sinclair's presence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to everything Hawkins had built. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. "What?" he barked. The door creaked open, and Kelly Morris stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Your Honor, may I have a word?" Hawkins gestured for her to enter, though his irritation was evident. "What is it, Morris?" "I'm busy." Kelly hesitated, then closed the door behind her. "Your Honor, I've reviewed some of the materials Mr. Sinclair presented. If this evidence holds up, it could have serious implications, not just for this case, but for others as well." Hawkins glared at her. "Are you questioning my integrity too?" "No, Your Honor," Kelly said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I think we need to consider the optics. If we proceed with a ruling against the defendant without addressing these concerns, it could backfire on all of us." Hawkins clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. "Do you think I don't know that? But dismissing the case now would be an admission of guilt, and I am not guilty of anything." Kelly's gaze hardened slightly. With respect, Your Honor, the evidence says otherwise. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Hawkins stared at her, his expression unreadable, before turning his back to her and gazing out the window. "Leave me, Morris," he said finally, his voice low. "I need time to think." Kelly hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." She left the room quietly, the door clicking shut behind her. Meanwhile, Andrew Sinclair stood outside the courthouse, speaking into a phone. His voice was calm but firm, a tone honed from years of navigating high-stakes situations. "Yes, the file has been submitted," he said. "It's airtight. If Judge Hawkins doesn't dismiss the charges, we have grounds to escalate." A pause. "I understand. I'll stay here until the case is resolved. But I'm not walking away from this, not until justice is served." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, his eyes scanning the bustling street. Sinclair had seen too many cases like this, cases where young lives were derailed by a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. He wasn't just here for Daniel Carter. He was here to make a point, to send a message to every judge, prosecutor, and lawyer who thought they could act without accountability. As he re-entered the courthouse, he was met with curious glances and whispers. Sinclair was used to it. His reputation as a disruptor of the status quo preceded him, and he wore it like armor. Back in the courtroom, the tension was nearly unbearable as everyone awaited the judge's return. Daniel sat rigidly in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. His mother whispered words of encouragement, but his mind was elsewhere. What if the judge ruled against him anyway? What if the evidence didn't matter? Sinclair walked in and took a seat near the back, his expression unreadable. Daniel glanced at him, searching for some sign of reassurance, but Sinclair offered none. He simply sat, his sharp gaze fixed on the bench where Judge Hawkins would soon return. The doors to the judge's chambers opened, and Hawkins emerged, his face a mask of forced composure. The room fell silent as he took his seat, his gavel poised, but not yet struck. After careful consideration, he began, his voice strained. "I have decided to recess this case until further notice. The evidence presented today warrants a thorough review, and I cannot, in good conscience, proceed without addressing the questions raised." The gallery erupted into whispers. Daniel's heart leaped in his chest. A recess wasn't a full dismissal, but it was something. A chance, however small, that justice might prevail. Furthermore, Hawkins continued, his voice tinged with bitterness, "I have been informed that the Department of Judicial Oversight will be conducting a review of my past rulings. I welcome the opportunity to prove that my decisions have always been guided by the law." Sinclair allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The first crack had appeared in the wall of impunity surrounding Hawkins, and Sinclair intended to widen it. The judge struck his gavel. "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to empty, Daniel turned to Sinclair, who was making his way toward the door. Summoning his courage, Daniel called out, "Mr. Sinclair." Sinclair paused and turned, his piercing gaze landing on the young man. "Yes." "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "I don't know why you came, but thank you." Sinclair walked over, his expression softening slightly. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. But remember this, the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard people try to bury it." With that, he walked out, leaving Daniel to ponder his words. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the faintest spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could reclaim his life. Beneath the surface, the courthouse had emptied, its echoes replaced by the hum of distant traffic and the quiet murmur of a city moving forward. Inside, Daniel Carter sat on a bench in the hallway, his mother beside him. She held his hand tightly, as though letting go might mean losing him to the dark tides that had threatened to engulf their lives. Despite the recess, Daniel felt far from free. The lingering weight pressed on his chest, the uncertainty of what would come next. "You should go home, Mom," he said quietly, though he didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the tiled floor beneath his scuffed shoes. "You've already missed so much work because of me." His mother shook her head, her voice firm despite the exhaustion lining her face. "You're my son, Daniel. Nothing is more important than standing by you." Her words were a balm, but they didn't erase his guilt. He hated that she had been dragged into this, that her faith in him had been tested by forces beyond their control. Daniel sighed and leaned back against the cold wall, closing his eyes. Meanwhile, Andrew Sinclair stood in a nearby conference room, the light from a flickering overhead bowl casting uneven shadows across his face. He was joined by Evan Marks, Daniel's lawyer, and an unexpected third figure, Kelly Morris, the prosecutor. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "Why am I here?" Kelly asked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her professional demeanor was intact, but there was a crack in her confidence, a subtle unease she couldn't quite mask. "You're here," Sinclair said evenly, "because you're smarter than Judge Hawkins gives you credit for. You've seen the evidence. You know this case is a sham." Kelly's jaw tightened. "I follow the law, Mr. Sinclair. The evidence I was provided supports the charges." "Does it?" Sinclair challenged, stepping closer. His piercing gaze pinned her in place. "Or have you been complicit in a system that buries the truth for the sake of expediency?" Evan interjected, his voice calm but insistent. "Ms. Morris, you know as well as I do that Daniel didn't belong in that courtroom today. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best. Add that to Judge Hawkins' questionable history, and you have more than enough reason to withdraw the charges." Kelly hesitated, glancing between the two men. She wanted to argue, to push back against their accusations, but the truth was gnawing at her resolve. She had read the files Sinclair had brought, the statistics, the testimonies, the damning patterns. It painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Finally, she sighed. "Let's say I believe you. Let's say the judge is biased, and the evidence is flimsy. What happens next? This isn't just about Daniel Carter. If what you're alleging is true, it could blow the lid off years of rulings. Are you prepared for that kind of fallout?" Sinclair's expression didn't waver. "Justice isn't about convenience, Ms. Morris. It's about doing what's right, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us." Kelly stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a reluctant nod, she said, "I'll need to make some calls." "You do that," Sinclair said. "But know this, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem." As Kelly left the room, Evan turned to Sinclair, his brow furrowed. "Do you really think she'll come around?" Sinclair's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I think she's already halfway there. People like Kelly don't want to be on the wrong side of history." Back in the hallway, Daniel was startled by the sudden appearance of Sinclair. The man approached with purposeful strides, his sharp gaze softened by an undercurrent of empathy. "How are you holding up?" Sinclair asked, taking a seat beside him. Daniel shrugged, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know. I guess I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop." Sinclair leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me tell you something, Daniel. The system we're up against, it thrives on fear, on people believing they don't have a chance. But the truth is, every system, no matter how corrupt, has cracks. Our job is to find them and pry them open." Daniel frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But why me? Why did you care enough to step in?" Sinclair's gaze grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the sterile walls of the courthouse. "Because I've been where you are," he said quietly. "I've seen what happens when the system turns its back on people who don't have the means to fight back. And I promised myself I'd do everything I could to make sure no one else had to go through that." Daniel's heart clenched at the sincerity in Sinclair's voice. He didn't know the details of this man's past, but he could sense the weight of it, the scars it had left behind. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sinclair nodded, his expression resolute. Don't thank me yet. This fight isn't over. In Judge Hawkins' chambers, the storm was brewing. He had spent the recess poring over the files Sinclair had presented, his hands trembling as he read through the evidence. Every page was a reminder of the walls closing in around him. The investigations, the complaints, the appeals, it was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door made him jump. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice raw. Kelly Morris stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor, we need to talk." Hawkins glared at her, his patience worn thin. "I don't have time for this, Morris." "You'll make time," she said firmly, stepping closer. "Because if you don't address this now, it won't just be your reputation on the line. It'll be your entire career." Hawkins opened his mouth to retort, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking. She was demanding accountability, and for the first time, Hawkins realized he was out of allies. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. "Dismiss the charges," Kelly said. "Admit that you were wrong, and let this case end here. If you don't, Sinclair will take this higher, and you know as well as I do that it won't end well for you." Hawkins slumped back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew she was right. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and there was no way to stop it. When court resumed later that afternoon, the gallery was packed with onlookers eager to see how the drama would unfold. Daniel sat nervously at the defense table, his mother gripping his hand tightly. Sinclair watched from the back, his expression calm but watchful. Judge Hawkins entered the room, his face drawn and pale. He took his seat and struck the gavel, though the usual authority in the gesture was absent. After reviewing the evidence, he began, his voice strained. "This court has determined that the charges against Daniel Carter will be dismissed." A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by a ripple of murmurs. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief, and his mother let out a soft cry of relief. Hawkins raised his gavel again, silencing the murmurs. "Furthermore, this court will cooperate fully with any investigation into its proceedings. Justice must be impartial, and any deviation from that standard must be addressed." The gallery erupted into applause, and for the first time, Hawkins didn't try to stop it. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on the empty space in front of him, a man undone by his own hubris. As the courtroom emptied, Sinclair approached Daniel and his mother. "It's over," he said simply. Daniel stood, his voice trembling with gratitude. "You didn't just save me, you saved my life." Sinclair placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You saved yourself, Daniel. You stood up when it mattered most. Don't forget that." As Sinclair walked away, Daniel watched him go, a sense of awe and determination filling him. The man who had stepped into his life uninvited had left an indelible mark, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed the day's events. And as Daniel stepped out into the sunlight with his mother by his side, he felt, for the first time, the weight of possibility, a future he could finally believe in. A ripple in the tide. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras clicking and microphones pointed at anyone who appeared remotely connected to the case. Daniel Carter felt overwhelmed as he stepped outside with his mother and his lawyer, even Marks. The bright sunlight seemed to pierce through him, as if laying bare every fear and doubt he still carried. Despite the dismissal of charges, the reality of what he had endured lingered like a shadow. "Daniel, over here," a reporter called out, pushing through the throng. "How do you feel about the judge's decision?" Another voice rang out. "Do you think justice was served today?" Daniel froze, unsure of how to respond. His mother, ever protective, wrapped her arm around him and guided him toward the parking lot. "No comment," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Even stayed behind, offering the press a few carefully worded statements about the importance of judicial integrity and the courage of those who challenge the system. But Daniel didn't hear any of it. His mind was elsewhere, racing with questions about what came next. As they reached the car, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Andrew Sinclair stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. His calm expression belied the chaos swirling around them. "Mr. Sinclair," Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence. "You're still here." Sinclair nodded. "I don't leave things unfinished." Daniel's mother spoke up, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've done so much for us already. How can we ever repay you?" Sinclair smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," she said, her voice trembling. "Use this second chance wisely," Sinclair said, locking eyes with Daniel. "Make it mean something." The ride home was quiet. Daniel stared out the window, watching the world blur past. For months, he had been consumed by fear. Fear of losing his freedom. Fear of being branded a criminal for something he hadn't done. Now that the immediate threat had passed, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness, as though the fight had drained something vital from him. His mother broke the silence. "Daniel," she said softly, "what that man did for you today, it's a blessing. But blessings come with responsibilities." "I know, Mom," Daniel replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. What could he possibly do to repay such an act of kindness? How could he make good on the opportunity he had been given? That night, as Daniel lay in bed, his mind replayed the events of the day over and over. He thought about Judge Hawkins' reluctant dismissal, Kelly Moore's hesitant shift in allegiance, and Sinclair's unwavering determination. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything. Unable to sleep, he got up and sat at his desk. The small room he shared with his younger brother was cluttered with schoolbooks, sketches, and half-finished projects. His eyes fell on an old notebook, its pages filled with ideas he'd once had for starting a community program, a safe space for kids in his neighborhood to gather, learn, and grow. It was something he had dreamed about for years, but never believed he could achieve. He flipped through the pages, his heart aching with a mix of nostalgia and regret. The world had always seemed stacked against him, making dreams like this feel impossible. But today, for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could change that. The next morning, Daniel called Evan Marks. "Mr. Marks," he said, his voice steady but nervous, "I need your help." Evan was surprised but intrigued. "Of course, Daniel. What's on your mind?" "I want to do something," Daniel said. "I want to make a difference, like Mr. Sinclair. I have this idea for a community program, but I don't know where to start." Evan smiled on the other end of the line. "You're already starting, Daniel. Let's meet later today, and we'll figure it out together." While Daniel began to take steps toward rebuilding his life, Andrew Sinclair was busy with another battle. Back in his office, he pored over files detailing Judge Hawkins' rulings and the complaints that had been filed against him over the years. The Department of Judicial Oversight had officially launched an investigation, and Sinclair was determined to see it through. He worked late into the night, fueled by a relentless drive to uncover the truth. Each document he reviewed painted a clearer picture of a man who had abused his power for far too long. Hawkins had systematically targeted vulnerable defendants, issuing harsher sentences to those who lacked the resources to fight back. Sinclair's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a text from an anonymous source. "More evidence on Hawkins. Check your email." He opened his laptop and found a series of attachments, emails, transcripts, and internal memos that suggested Hawkins had colluded with certain prosecutors to secure convictions, regardless of the strength of the evidence. Sinclair's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about bias. It was corruption at the highest level. Meanwhile, Judge Hawkins was facing his own reckoning. News of the investigation had spread, and the local media was relentless in their coverage. His once loyal allies were distancing themselves, and his reputation was in tatters. He sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared at the glowing screen of his laptop. Every headline felt like a dagger. Judge Hawkins under fire. Decades of judicial bias exposed. Calls for reform after shocking courtroom revelation. Justice denied. How one man's hubris destroyed lives. Hawkins slammed his glass down, the liquid spilling across the desk. He had spent his career believing he was untouchable, but now he was realizing just how fragile his empire truly was. Days turned into weeks, and the ripples from Daniel's case continued to spread. Community leaders began calling for systemic reform, demanding greater oversight of judges and prosecutors. Sinclair's investigation into Hawkins gained traction, and whispers of further indictments began to circulate. Through it all, Daniel kept his head down and focused on his dream. With Evan's help, he secured funding for his community program and began reaching out to local organizations for support. The program, which he named Second Chances, aimed to provide mentorship, education, and resources for at-risk youth. It was a way to give back, to ensure that no one else would have to face the struggles he had endured alone. At the grand opening of the program, Daniel stood before a small crowd of supporters, including his mother, Evan, and even Andrew Sinclair. He took a deep breath, his nerves threatening to overwhelm him. But when he looked out and saw their encouraging faces, he found his voice. "This program isn't just about me," Daniel began. "It's about all of us, about the power we have to lift each other up, to fight for justice, and to create opportunities where none exist. I was given a second chance, and I want to make sure that others get theirs too." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Daniel stepped down, Sinclair approached him. "You've done well," Sinclair said, a rare smile gracing his face. Daniel grinned, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in months. "I had good examples." Sinclair nodded. "Keep going, Daniel. The fight for justice doesn't end. It evolves. But people like you, you're the reason it's worth fighting." As the crowd dispersed, Daniel looked out at the community he was beginning to build. For the first time in his life, he felt not just hopeful but empowered. The system that had tried to break him had failed. And now he was determined to be a force for change, a ripple in the tide that would one day become a wave, the light that breaks through. Weeks turned into months, and the echoes of the courtroom battle reverberated far beyond Daniel Carter's small corner of the city. His life had taken on a momentum he hadn't thought possible, propelled by the chain of events ignited that fateful day. As his community program, Second Chances, grew, so did his confidence. What had started as a desperate fight for survival had transformed into a mission to uplift others. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for Andrew Sinclair. Far from the community center where Daniel was building his future, Andrew Sinclair stood before a panel of his peers in the ornate hearing room of the Department of Judicial Oversight. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each filled with volumes of legal precedent, a silent reminder of the weight of their task. Sinclair faced the panel with the same calm resolve he had shown in Judge Hawkins' courtroom. "Mr. Sinclair," one of the senior investigators began, adjusting her glasses, "your report has outlined significant misconduct on the part of Judge Gerald Hawkins. The evidence you've presented is thorough, but we must ask, why this case? Why now?" Sinclair clasped his hands in front of him, his gaze steady. "Because justice delayed is justice denied." For years, Judge Hawkins operated with impunity, his actions eroding public trust in our legal system. Daniel Carter's case was the tipping point, but it is far from an isolated incident. It was time to act. The room was silent, save for the scratch of pens on paper as the panelists took notes. The investigator leaned forward. "And what do you propose as a solution? Removing Hawkins from the bench won't fix systemic issues." Sinclair allowed a small smile. "No, it won't. But it's a start. Accountability isn't just about punishing bad actors. It's about setting a standard. If we let men like Hawkins go unchecked, we tell every other judge that bias and corruption are acceptable." The panel exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. We'll deliberate and notify you of our decision." Sinclair nodded, but he didn't wait for their thanks. He turned and left the room, his focus already on the battle still ahead. Back in Daniel's world, the community center was thriving. The once abandoned building now buzzed with life. Kids playing basketball in the gym, young adults attending workshops on job readiness and financial literacy, and families gathering for support meetings. Daniel moved through the space like a man reborn, his energy infectious. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel stood in the courtyard of the center, watching a group of teenagers plant a garden as part of their environmental science program. One of them, a lanky boy named Jamal, looked up at him. "Hey, Mr. Carter," Jamal called, grinning. "You ever think it'd get this big?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Honestly, no, but sometimes things grow when you least expect them." Jamal nodded, his grin widening. "Kinda like this garden, huh?" "Exactly," Daniel said, clapping him on the shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, a familiar figure approached the courtyard. Daniel turned to see Andrew Sinclair, dressed in his usual sharp suit, carrying a folder under one arm. "Mr. Sinclair," Daniel greeted him warmly. "What brings you here?" Sinclair smiled faintly. "Call me Andrew. I came to check on you, and to deliver some news." They stepped aside to a quieter corner of the courtyard. Sinclair handed Daniel the folder. "Judge Hawkins has been formally removed from the bench," the panel ruled unanimously. "He'll face additional investigations for corruption, and there's a strong chance criminal charges will follow." Daniel's breath caught. "It's really over." "For him, yes," Sinclair said. "But for the system, the fight is just beginning." Hawkins was a symptom of a larger problem. There are others like him, and they won't go down without a fight. Daniel nodded, the weight of Sinclair's words sinking in. "So what happens now?" "Now," Sinclair said, his voice firm, "we keep pushing. People like you and me. We don't stop until the system works for everyone." In the months that followed, the ripple effects of Hawkins' removal were felt across the legal community. Judges, prosecutors, and public defenders began re-examining their practices, and calls for judicial reform gained traction at both the state and national levels. Sinclair's investigation became a blueprint for accountability, inspiring others to speak out against corruption. But for Daniel, the changes were personal as much as they were systemic. He became a vocal advocate for reform, using his platform to share his story and amplify the voices of others who had been silenced by the system. His program expanded, partnering with schools and local businesses to provide mentorship opportunities and scholarships. One evening, Daniel stood on a small stage at a local fundraiser for Second Chances, addressing a crowd of supporters. His mother sat in the front row, her eyes brimming with pride. Sinclair stood in the back, his arms crossed, a rare look of satisfaction on his face. "When I walked into that courtroom months ago," Daniel began, "I thought my life was over. I thought the system would swallow me whole. But one man stood up when no one else would. He reminded me that justice isn't just about laws. It's about people." The crowd erupted into applause, and Daniel's voice grew stronger. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. That's why this program exists, to give others the second chances they deserve. Together, we can build a world where justice truly means something." As the applause swelled, Daniel looked out at the crowd, his heart full. He spotted Sinclair in the back, giving him a small nod of approval. For the first time, Daniel truly believed in the power of change, not just for himself, but for everyone. Later that night, as the fundraiser wound down, Sinclair approached Daniel. "You've come a long way," he said. Daniel smiled. "I had good help." Sinclair chuckled softly. "You had the courage to fight. That's something no one can give you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling between them. Then Sinclair extended his hand. "You're going to do great things, Daniel." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Thanks to you, Andrew, for everything." As Sinclair walked away into the night, Daniel felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but now he was ready. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a beacon of hope, a force for change. And as he turned back toward the glowing lights of the community center, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of a brighter future.